I first came to this conference 3 years ago, and what I was really impressed with was the turnout and how many people were here and how interested they were learning about their watershed. To me, that is a symbol of why we're here in the first place. People care about their watershed. People care about their relationship with the streams and the rivers and the watersheds that drain to those water bodies. And why that's important is because if we didn't have an engaged community like yourselves, we would not be able to do the things that we're going to present that we're going to do. With engaged community members, your passion, your understanding, your involvement, really what drives a lot of these stream management projects. They help make these things come to fruition. Because without an engaged community, we'd be developing these solutions in a complete bubble. And when we brought the bubble to you, it would be burst, and we wouldn't be able to implement what we had put out there. So having engaged community members involved in these processes for stream management is really important. That's why I was really excited 3 years ago when I came here that we had such a good turnout. So what I'm going to talk to today is about why we are where we are in terms of our relationship with our streams and our rivers. And you've heard the term, the local flood analysis, kicked around a couple times. There are several communities within this watershed that have these ongoing analyses. There's other watersheds over in Walton and Delhi, in that area, that are doing their own local flood analysis. The purpose of the local flood analysis is to do an informed approach to stream management, to flood management. We know through the more recent floods, old floods all the way back to '96 and even earlier than that, we have a problem here. And we wouldn't be here talking about flood management and mitigation if we didn't have flood problems. So we have those. And so what we're trying to do with these local flood analyses is to do an informed approach before the flood hits. Because typically our responses to flooding are an emotional response. We're in survival mode. The adrenaline's pumping. We get the bulldozers out. We get the excavators out, and we want to do something. We want to remove the large woody debris. We want to excavate the sediment out. Usually a knee-jerk response. These LFAs are more of an informed approach. Let's take actions before the flood hits and do these actions so they're sustainable, financially, socially, and from an engineering standpoint. So part of that informed approach is understanding the historical context of why we are where we are today. Why is that important? Because our streams have been running for many, many, many thousands of years before Europeans settled this area. And that behavior is what has set the stage for where we are today. And what I'm going to present to you today is a brief walkthrough through historical context of our relationship with the land, with our relationship with the streams, and why we're facing these flooding problems that we are. So I like to preface this entire presentation with one of my more favorite quotes is, "You cannot step twice into the same river." And when I first heard this quote, I was like, well, that makes a lot of sense. I step in a river and the water's moving by, and then if I step in the river again 5 minutes later, it's a different water molecule that I'm stepping by. And then as I started getting more into the understanding of geomorphology, geomorphology is a science of the interaction between water and the surrounding land masses, understand that there's a lot more going on in a river than just the water moving by. There's also sediment that's moving by. There's also other forms of debris. So, in my opinion, one of the earliest geomorphologists is Heraclitus, if that's how you pronounce it correctly, who is around in 402 AD. And because he had this is his quote, is that he was probably understanding that, yes, not only were there water processes going on, but there were also sediment processes going on as well. So, here we are today in the Ashokan Reservoir watershed. We're down here. The watershed begins right where the dam ends. And about 255 square miles of area drains into the reservoir. We have in this topographic map here, the shaded topographic map, we have hillsides and we have river valleys. And one thing to note here is that the highest point is at Slide Mountain, which is at 4,100 feet. And then the reservoir water surface elevation is about 635 feet. So there's over 3,500 feet of elevation gain and loss through this watershed. So it's quite a diverse watershed. And the activities that happen up here in the top part of the watershed in the headwaters, they have an influence on our rivers down below. And as we step through this presentation, we'll talk about some of the activities that happen up in the headlands, have a direct impact with some of the bigger tribs, and also on this Esopus, which drains about 75% of the drainage area into the reservoir. So what is our relationship today with our streams and rivers? Well, an in-stream relationship, a lot of recreation, fishing, whitewater activities, and of course the drinking water supply for local communities and also the city. What is our relationship with the floodplain? The floodplain, as I'll explain in a second, is the landform adjacent to the river. Well, we have agriculture. You drive along the river valleys, you'll see cornfields and other hay fields along there. We'll also see our communities, residents and businesses. We live along on the floodplains because they're a really flat area to build. Also our roads and infrastructure, pipelines, etc., usually run parallel with the river valleys. And also we have forested areas down along the rivers. So the terms that I just used, just to take a step back, is in-stream. When I mean in-stream is the area between the top of banks. That's usually the active corridor where water is transported, where sediment is transported. And the floodplain is this landmass that's adjacent to the in-stream. So a floodplain, by definition, is an area that is flooded. When the water level rises and spills out of the in-stream, it spills into the floodplain and is generally stored there and is connected. You find this relationship of in-stream and floodplain, whether it's in the bigger river valleys down below, like along the Esopus, or up in the higher elevations in the major tribs. The size of the floodplain varies depending on the valley walls. I'll show an example of that in a second. So here's another figure that explains the in-stream and the floodplain. The in-stream here, as you see here, is the wetted perimeter, where most of the water is contained for most of the time. But during flood events, the water will spill out of the in-stream and into our floodplains. Now, this is a natural process. The rivers do this because during flood times, the water is moving very quickly. It has a lot of energy, and water, when it has a lot of energy, will move things such as sediment, such as logs, etc. And rivers are a natural system. They want to always go on a diet by releasing energy, and by spilling, they actually spill over onto the floodplains and release a lot of energy that way. So not a problem if we don't have any buildings or infrastructure that exist along the floodplain. But we're not in that situation. And the study that was done, the Upper Esopus Creek Stream Management Plan in 2007, the top two issues that were done, I forget how many respondents were, but I think there was several hundred, if not 1,000 or so. Top two issues that people had with the watershed was the erosion of stream banks and private property and flood damage to homes. So we have a problem. We have infrastructure in the way of where streams naturally are supposed to flood. So this is what we have. This is what happens. During the tropical storms in 2011, and even in other more minor flooding events, we have our buildings, we have our infrastructure that are sitting in that floodplain that we just saw. And you've seen the photos, you've lived through it, so this isn't an abstract concept. This is something that you live with during times of duress. So what we're trying to do with these local flood analysis is to still have our communities within these active floodplains, building resiliency so we can still live our lives in here, but we also can allow the streams to do what they want to do naturally. So here's the other part of the top concern is eroding banks. Eroding banks, they don't look pretty. There's no vegetation that turns the water brown. And also, if we have houses that line along the top part of these eroding banks, then that's another hazard. So what we're trying to do is in these local flood analyses is make an informed approach. Why do we have eroding banks where they're eroding? Why do we have flooding in areas where we have flooding where we have homes? So the important part of this process is to understand the historical context of what got us to where we are today. Why our communities are now sandwiched between two active river corridors. And to understand the historical context then helps inform the solutions. Because if we are trying to mitigate hundreds of years of stream processes by doing a particular solution, well, we better be darn sure that we're just not trying to push water uphill because we have the historical context driving all these entire processes. So today, I was fortunate enough to play around with one of our more favorite movies that featured a time flux capacitor, which is a mechanism that allows us to go back and forth through time. And I was able to switch out the flux capacitor circuitry and replace them with stream flux capacitor circuitry to allow us to go back and look at some stream management techniques, historical stream management techniques, and then also some potential future ones. So, we just came from 1985 with Doc and Marty McFly, and so today is April 11th in our present time, and then we're going to fly back to where it really all began in this area, right at the tail end of the Ice Age. The Ice Age in this area and some other parts of New York State were under hundreds, if not thousands of feet of ice. And so what that does is that really clears a blank slate for us. Because once that ice recedes, that's when everything starts to begin. So we start, we get in our car, we hit, I think it was 90 miles per hour. We fly backwards into time, and bring your down jackets, because here we are. We're just looking back at the glaciers. That black box the black rectangle box right there represents roughly where we are. And we are on the perimeter of where the glaciers in the most recent ice age, which officially kind of ended right around 10,000 years ago, we're kind of close to the terminal extent. But as glaciers started to recede, they started to drop out all the things that they've picked up along their travels. So glaciers, not just they only contain ice, but they also contain sediments, rocks, gravels, sands. And when glaciers start to melt, they form glacial lakes. And all those sediments start to pile up, and they form moraines, which is it's a term that describes unconsolidated sediment that is washing out from the glaciers. So as these glaciers recede, these moraines and cartons start to form, and you start to have unconsolidated sediments such as gravels and cobbles, hundreds of feet thick. So when these glaciers, and we know this from what we can see and where we have existing glaciers. At the end of these glaciers, we have large amounts of debris and sediments that are formed from there. And as the glaciers melt, the runoffs start to form rivers, and those rivers start to cut through some of these glacial deposits. Now, one of the things is that not all watersheds are created equal. Not all rivers are created equal. So in some areas, in some watersheds, we won't have large unconsolidated deposits of glacial features, but in some we do. So we have to keep that in mind in our historical context, and we're doing an investigation of what might be the historical sediment supply in this area. We would look for sufficient geological formations that may indicate, here are large swaths of unconsolidated sediments that were left after the glaciers retreated. So after the glaciers retreated, we immediately had a large, vast area without large woody material, such as tall trees and everything. But within a couple thousand years, we started to have these large coniferous forests, the Boreal Forest that started to form. In present day, you'd find these right on the fringe of the Arctic Circle in Siberia and Canada. These are conifers that can really withstand very cold temperatures. But take in mind that this took a couple thousand years for this vegetation to come in, and so within those time frames, we still had time where those sediments were moving freely because there was no vegetation to hold them in place. There was no mature soil to help them for the vegetation to grow. So we had free-flowing sediment transport happening during that time. And it wasn't until we started seeing these forests start to take over and replenish the areas that were cleared out by the glaciers before the sediments started to freeze. So, that's one thing to think about, is that, before the vegetation came in, we had free-moving sediment moving through the system. And then when these forests came into place and started to anchor all the stream banks and everything into stream banks and floodplains, that's when things started to slow down in terms of sediment transport and the sediments moving through our rivers. So then, over the course of the next 1,000 years, this is when our cool temperate forest, the existing forest that we see outside, the mix of the deciduous and coniferous trees, start to move up through to replace these the hard boreal forest. And then we had this nice system where we had a mixed forest. We had roots, large trees that had roots that helped stabilize the stream banks and the floodplains. So that's what it was. And now let's go back to more of a warmer time. And we're going to jump into our DeLorean and head and fast forward here to 1824. The significance of this date was that this is probably about 6 or 7 decades after first European settlers started to come in here. So we started to have some more development and some more communities started to go. So this was a happy time. The rivers were full of fish, and the woods were full of game and booze, and men were men, and sheep were nervous, maybe. So this is the thing, is that in here we had very fertile river valleys, where we had a lot of fish. We had a lot of other kind of good connection between rivers and their floodplains. And up in the highlands, we had the bigger trees that were there that would help stabilize the hillsides. So as the time went by, the people of those times started having a relationship with their streams. It was a food source. It was also transportation, where people could go upstream and downstream, either very easily along the banks or within a canoe. It also provided drinking water for people. That's where they would get their source from, either smaller springs or from rivers. And on the floodplain, that's when they started to hash it out, where they started to cut down trees and build their agricultural fields. The river valleys, the floodplains were really good spots for agriculture because usually they were well draining, and also they would flood from time to time, depositing really beneficial sediments that replenished the soils for their nutrient value. And also they were a form of energy where people could cut down adjacent trees for firewood to keep their houses warm during the winter months. So, so farming was really focused along the river valley floors. There was good draining soil that was there from the glacial outwash that we just talked about a few minutes ago. And, but as farming continued and started to expand and people started to grow more fields and there was more farmers taking over, they were faced with a dilemma. The valley walls, as I talked about before, those are the formations that really define the valley floor. There are very notable features that go straight up at very steep slopes, and in between those is what we would call the valley floor. And on the valley floor, that's typically where you'd find the rivers and streams. So the question was, why did the farmer cross the stream? Well, obviously, because he wanted to farm the other side. So he would do that, but he would come home at the end of the day and his family would complain that his boots were wet and he was tracking mud into the house and people weren't very happy with him. So they wanted, and he heard enough about it over the course of the months that he decided to, well, I'm just going to, move this stream all the way over to the valley, the other side, so now I don't have to cross that stream anymore and listen to people complain about my muddy boots, and now I'll have, a big wide field to farm into. Well, when that happens, basically we go from a stream that is sinuous, meaning it has turns within the stream, and then we go from that kind of situation to more of a straight channel. Now, slope is a mathematical term that describes the steepness or the flatness of a line. So at this point here, we have a fixed elevation, and then at this point, we have a fixed elevation. So the change between those two elevations is our change in vertical change. And then the length between here and that point is the distance. So you take that vertical change divided by distance, that's a slope, that's the steepness of the line. Well, if I take away all that turns in that stream and when I move it over to the other side, I basically reduce the horizontal distance, I shorten it up. So what that does then, if we can remember correctly back to 8th grade math, is that you reduce the denominator and the numerator stays the same, then your slope increases. It's early in the morning, so that's math, so I apologize if I got that wrong. What slope does, and slope is one of the more important things in stream management techniques, especially with sediment transport, is that it's one of the main drivers for it. If we were to increase a slope, we were now to push more sediments and move the water faster. A great when water moves faster, it has a greater force to move things. And one thing it loves to move is the stream, the material along the bottom of the stream bed, rocks, your gravels and sands and cobbles. And that force is captured in a term called shear stress. One great example for shear stress is to go into the bathroom down here in the men's bathroom, and ladies, you can go in there and tell them that George sent you in there. And you go underneath the hand dryer there, the accelerator, or whatever the term was, the model, and you stick your hand underneath it, and it's such a fast-moving air that your flesh starts moving to the side and side. Whereas if you were to go to like a generic one in a 7-Eleven, it's very kind of meandering through, it doesn't really move your skin. Well, air is a fluid as well, and that fastness coming out of it and moving your skin around is a force being applied to your skin. Much the same way rivers are going to move sediment. The faster it comes out, the faster it moves through the channel, the more things are going to move around, like my veins that were getting dried off. So the farmer then moves the river over, increases the steepness of the slope, and what happens is that then the channel starts to move faster, the water starts to move faster, and starts to excavate and move more sediments, and it deepens. So basically the channel bottom, where it was at day one, drops down to where over time, as the water starts moving faster and faster. So we start leaving the early 1800s and start moving to more of the later 1800s, where we have more people living in the valleys, more people are starting to settle, and industry starts to take over. So we jump in a DeLorean, we have to weave through all the trees and try to get up to the 90 miles per hour, and we jump into the late 1800s. So how has our relationship between our streams, corridors, and our floodplains changed? Well, we still have some fishing going on, and there's less and less transportation now because we have railroads starting to develop through the system. But we also have still using it for drinking water and for sewage, for sometimes of getting rid of waste. On the floodplains, it's a totally different story. We are now having industry starting to take over the watershed. Tanneries are starting to form, that they produce goods that are sold down into the bigger cities. We have charcoal kilns, which charcoal was developed because it's a much more efficient energy source. So charcoal would be made up here in the upper parts of the watershed and then sold down to the bigger cities because it was a much better energy source for them to burn in their stoves. Quarries were starting to develop, and the railroad started to come up through. So our relationship with our floodplains and our relationship with our watershed in general has started to change. We started to have bigger impacts on the surrounding areas. And one thing that was, I found interesting in going through some of the historical documents was this relationship between drinking water and sewage. And I saw this is a cholera notice that came out in mid-1800s. And here you have a whole list of people who had cholera, and then right next to them, the people who died from cholera. And cholera is a drinking water contaminant, ill-born disease. And so, that says a lot to patient confidentiality, what it was then and what it is now. So we're having problems. We're starting to see the watershed start to stress because the relationship that we've had with the watershed has started to change. We are now physically altering the watershed. So for thousands of years since the last glacial ice, the last glaciers have receded, the watersheds have developed, gone through different changes in vegetation and biomass, and started to, really were anchored in place. But now we have come in and support the industry. We've started to clear the watershed of all mature vegetation in order to feed charcoal kilns and some of the other particular industries that were prevalent in the late 1800s. So at this time, it became until into the late 1800s where there was really no forest. 80 to 90% of the original growth forest was gone. And so you can imagine driving through the highways along here and looking up in the hillsides and seeing it all green, dark green because of all the forest. Well, that was gone. You can imagine those scenes without having any trees up through there. And so, this is a photo of down here, but I think we've seen different views of it. But what I'm looking for in the back is some of the denuded hillsides where there is no mature vegetation. Those trees were extremely important to hold the hillsides together. And what had happened in logging is not only did the trees get felled, but also a lot of the land got tussled up as well during those activities. So what happens is we now know through our hydrological studies that if we change the land use, if we denude our forest, the amount of water that comes off that land during a rainstorm increases. And depending on the level of deforestation, that amount of water could double, if not triple, coming out, depending on the underlying soils. We know this because we've done studies in the 50s and 60s on the relationship between land use and runoff. But also, even today, we can see these events out in the Northwest where areas are being clear-cut, still clear-cut, where large swaths of land are being completely obliterated of all trees. And when that happens, we start to see these huge gullies and rills starting to form. So imagine our watershed looking similar to this, where 80 to 90% of our forests are gone. And we're starting to see these large gullies starting to form in their watersheds. And so what these large gullies do, they become very effective of transporting sediments from the top part of our watersheds all the way down. And so now we have sediments that are moving that didn't used to move for thousands of years, and now we have a more effective way to move them because we have more water going back there. Remember what we just talked about with the analogy with the hand dryer, is that with the faster moving water, we can move bigger stuff through here. So a lot of the sediments that may have been up there in the native soils that have been there since the last formation of the Ice Age are now moving down into our valley floors. Whether it's from the valleys just up here in the tributaries, or even the major valleys down below, like in the Sopus Creek. We now have sediments moving there that haven't been moving for thousands of years. So what does this go back to our farmer Bob here and where he's living? Well, he's still farming his land. He's pretty happy. Now railroads come in here so we can move some goods. People are moving up through here so he can sell his goods. So now the railroad is starting to be put into the valley floors. Now you can look for channelization in certain areas. If you were to drive up in certain valleys, look off, and if you see the road that you're driving on or a different road hugs the valley wall for a while, or the river hugs the valley wall for a while, and it's really, really straight for a long stretch of period of time without any of those turns, there's a good chance that someone has moved that river and that stream and moved it over to the valley wall. And whether that was done 100 years ago, 200 years ago, for whatever reason, it's still there. And so it's not where it used to be before this area was colonized. Now we get into complication that we have railroads in the area. And railroads are a static feature next to a dynamic river process. And usually those two things don't like each other very much. So what do we do in those instances? Well, we do something called armoring, or using riprap, which is large stones. And what we're trying to do is keep that river that's moving along the railroad from eroding the railroad out. So now we have a static railroad infrastructure along the valley wall, and now we have a dynamic river right next to it, and the river is not very happy because it wants to be that meandering river that we saw earlier, but it's straight now, and so the water's moving faster. So in order to compensate, we need to armor the railroad to protect the railroad from being washed out. So now, as the one side of this river valley is being armored, the river can't really go through the railroad anymore, so now it has to go the other way. Now we go through a process called channel widening. where the river is done going deeper anymore. It's exhausted going that way. So now it's going to start to widen out. And so it's going to start to move back across the valley wall. Well, our farmer doesn't really like that, because when rivers start to get really, really shallow, and if there's still a connection between the in-stream and the floodplain, we start getting more frequent flooding, because now the river has filled up with all the sediment that has started to move off the hillsides and filled up the channel to a point where the channel doesn't have the capacity anymore to move the floodwater. So what does it do? It spills off into the floodplains. And now we have more frequent flooding. Well, now our farmer Bob, his feet are getting wet again, and people are complaining in his house that he's tracking in mud because his fields are flooding more. So he comes up, he thinks about it for a while and kind of scratches his head what he wants to do. Well, he's like, okay, well, I'm going to build a little earthen berm. I'm going to keep that floodwater from getting in my field and keep everyone in my house happy because they're not getting mud anymore. So an earthen berm is a dike, as we were just were told about. It's a physical feature that just comes up, and it's usually made out of compacted earth, and it's usually higher than the water, the floods that were previously flooding the floodplain. So now we have another stream management technique that was being used in the late 1800s to keep areas where we have either farm fields or communities from getting flooded. So here's an example of a dike. On one side there's a dike that runs around this way, and on this side was where the river would be, and this side is where they would put the area where they wanted to protect. So just in summary, now we're having a lot of pressures on our streams and our relationship. We have more problems going on. We have bad water quality, as we heard about from the cholera notice, and then also from an aquatic standpoint. By the late 1800s, our eastern brook trout, our native fish species, were pretty much wiped out, gone. And so it's such to a point that they started bringing in browns and rainbows to help compensate for the loss of eastern brook trouts. And this was, over 100 years ago that we're talking that this happened, and we're still dealing with eastern brook trout just not surviving very well for a lot of different reasons. So, the water quality is, was pretty bad because of the industry, because of the sediments, etc. There's also another point that when we're looking at reviewing of the historical analysis of particular watersheds, is a role that dams played, either grist mills or sawmills dams, because when a dam is put into place, as we know here, it basically stops the movement of water freely going downstream. And when that happens, not only does the water stop, but also the sediment that goes downstream stops as well. And when the stream downstream is robbed of sediment, it doesn't really like that very much because it's used to carrying sediment, and it'll start to look for sediment, whether from eroding banks or from the channel bed. So we're getting out of this really depressed time. We've lost our native fish species. We have our rivers full of stream sediments. We have more flooding problems going on. So it's a really kind of a depressed time. So let's get out of here and let's go to 1928, where now this watershed is starting to be managed, where the water quality is starting to become very important because of the dam that was built. It's supplying drinking water. After the dam was built, people started thinking, well, we've got to manage the water, the quality of water coming into our reservoir because we want to have clean drinking water. So that's when we started seeing a lot of large-scale restoration throughout the watershed, whether it's up on the hillsides or in the valley walls. And our relationship has started to change again with our relationship with the in-stream portion of our rivers and also on the floodplains. So, we still have fishing, we still have drinking water in there for communities and also for the city, and some sewage at some point, but that's starting to take a back seat. But now in this time, we started to have more towns and communities start to develop on our other floodplains outside of what used to be through here. And now our railways are starting to give way to roads because now we have combustional engines that we can produce in mass quantities. And then in the watershed, as we can see here, we have massive reforestation attempts because people are starting to recognize that denuded forests cause water quality problems. So we started to put in a lot more trees through there. So, roads are starting to develop along the valley walls. This is a really good example of, we have a river that's been potentially manipulated, but we still have a static piece of infrastructure right through here. And you know, these are pretty classic guardrails, which I probably wouldn't suggest having now, but it was good fun at the time. But looking at it, you can see, you know, how that river is hugging that static piece of environment, that static piece of infrastructure. And we have to protect that because every time it washes out, it has to be rebuilt. And that's time, it's material, it's resources. And you can imagine now, like just driving along on the roads, whether they're local county roads or state roads, how often you notice that river right up against the edge of that road. And it's there for a reason, because it probably at one point was one of those kind of roads. And before that was maybe a goat trail or a deer trail at some point. But it's, you know, these are things that we have to keep in mind of why we're locked into the valleys that we are, is that it's based on our historic behaviors. So now our farmer Bob, he's getting kind of tired of everyone complaining about his muddy boots and about, you know, having to, you know, farm the areas, and he's coming up with an idea about, well, how can I make some money without farming? Well, geez, I'm just going to start to grow houses on my farm field. So he starts selling off his land, and you see that all the time now. I grew up in a farm community, and we had a lot of apple orchards, and you can go back now, and those apple orchards are replaced with houses. So here, you know, you have, instead of growing corn, you're growing homes. So now our communities start to develop along those floodplains. And so, you know, here, we have houses and more other infrastructure where people live closer and closer to rivers. But we still have some problems with denuded hills. We still have sediment influxes that are coming on through, and our valleys are really starting to, you know, work through that. Because with now the reforestation program going on, it's now starting to reduce the amount of high water that's flowing off the hillsides. So go back to the right after the last ice age, where we didn't have a lot of large trees and everything holding down our hillsides. We now are, and we had a lot of sediments moving through the system. Now we're back into that situation where we just had a big influx of sediments moving through the system, but now our hillsides are starting to become reforested. So it's reducing the amount of water that's flowing off. The amount of water that flows off results in slower moving water and less frequently fast-moving water events. So now we have this, you know, this game going on now that we have a bunch of gravels and cobbles in our system that aren't moving very frequently anymore because now our hillsides are reforested. So it's kind of like this balance between, you know, going between if your hands are wet and you're going to the 7-Eleven, you're trying to wash it, and like, well, then you go, oh, well, I should just wait until I get to the Ashokan Watershed Center, then I can really know I can get my hands off. But you only can go there infrequently, so your hands remain wet more frequently, and which is not good for handshaking behavior. And here, it's the same thing with our streams, is that now we have all these sediments through here, and there's less and less water to move those sediments through, and it's not until we get those episodic events where we start really seeing much more sediments moving through the system. And so now we have these areas where we still have are plugged full of sediments, and the channels are wide, they're antebrated, meaning that you have different threads going through there, and they're shallow. So now we have this wonderful invention called the combustible engine. It allows us to do a lot of cool things, bigger, heavier machinery, and so to help with the shallow streams and more frequent flooding problems that happen from it, we do a practice called dredging. And dredging is, as you see here, it's usually done by machinery, and it scoops up all the sediment, the gravels and cobbles out of the riverbed, and toss them aside, and either they're bermed up next to the river itself or hauled off site. So here's an example of just a configuration of a dredging barge where it will scoop up the sediments from the bottom, deepening the channel, and then spitting it out the other side, whether into a berm or into a nearby train. So what this does is that if we lower the channel bed, then that will increase the capacity within the channel to move floodwaters through here. So that was the first original thought about how to do flood management was, oh, well, if we make the channel deeper, then we'll save ourselves from the flooding. But if we remember back to that first slide with the farmer, if you channelize the channel and you make it faster, then the channel itself will become unstable because it becomes faster, it starts moving more sediment, it wants to move bigger stuff, and so the channel will start to unravel because it's now not in the configuration it wants to. So those berms are then, built up, and as we saw before in what the farmer was doing back in the mid to late 1800s, we're doing now with machinery. And so we're over widening our channels because we also think like, well, if we just make it wider, that makes the river water shallower, and then we can convey more water through that way. So two common approaches to flood management are either dredging or over widening the channel and putting in berms, which would keep the channel contained. So, now let's jump from that time period where we're starting to see more of this engineered approach to stream management and flood mitigation. Let's go back, return today for a second, and start talking about what do we know? Well, we have about 5 or 6 decades of understanding what works and what doesn't work in flood mitigation solutions. We know that, and we have a better understanding of the historical context between the relationship of the watershed and the streams. So we know that the streams have been moved. We know streams have been blasted by more than normal higher flows when the hillsides were denuded. Streams have been choked full of sediment from these high flows, but now with reforestation we have less runoff, and so it takes a bigger storm to move sediments through the system. And streams have gone through channelization where they've been dredged, where they've been moved through, or they've over widened because we've widened the streams out and put berms through here. This figure here is a classic channel succession model where it shows going from 1 all the way through stage 6 that as the channel is intervened with, like if it's dredged, for instance, it becomes channelized. And when it becomes channelized, it will start to eat away at the channel bed, which we talked about. Then water starts moving faster, starts moving more sediment through there. And then if a channel goes through this area where we have sediments that are starting to move through the system and deposit in certain areas, then the channel starts to widen, and then we start to see eroding banks where we are. So this is kind of a good model to talk about when we're looking at why we have eroding banks where we're having, why we're having flooding where we're having, because if we think about the historical context of where the stream has started and where it is now and where it may be going, that helps inform designs, sustainable designs. So, for here, we even see some of the relic stream management techniques that are out there. So in here, on my drive to Delhi yesterday, it was kind of a cool time because the West Delaware was pretty close to spilling out onto its floodplains. But here you could see an earthen berm that was put in there to keep that farmer's feet from getting wet and keeping and preventing any of the flood waters from starting to pour over here. But down here where that earthen berm is gone, we start seeing more floodplain connection. So, when we approach these kind of opportunities for local flood analysis, we look at, well, if there are houses on the other side here and those houses are becoming flooded, is there an opportunity to maybe remove an earthen berm or other kind of obstructions, whether they're bridges or culverts or whatever, to help alleviate the flooding in the homes adjacent to those structures. So, we also have this time where we can reflect on, well, what has worked and what hasn't worked in terms of stream management. For example, the channel widening that we've talked about a second ago, where the objective was if we widen the channel and shallow it and make the waters shallower, then we have much more conveyance to move the floodwaters through because they won't be as high. Well, this is an example of why that technique doesn't work. Here we have a river, a stream that was over widened and bermed, where it has very little floodplain to connect to, and this is pretty much right after construction. But what I want you to notice is what happens in this river corridor downstream, in this area through here. So, and this is the date, it was 8/14/06, and then just within a little more than 2 months, we start seeing stream bank erosion through here. And why that is, again, is that the stream when it was built, there was no turns, it was channelized, it was pretty darn straight. Well, streams don't like to be straight, they like to be turning. And so now you can see it's starting to want to turn. Process caused by the stream moving faster because it's straighter, and it's starting to eat away at its channel bed, and it's starting eating away at the stream banks right next to it to help build this sinuosity through the system. Well, now we'll fast forward just 2 months later after that, and you can really start to see where these areas are being scalped out and eroded. And next to it, you have these floodplains are starting to form. Floodplains. Why do we need floodplains? Well, those are the areas where the stream floods during flooding times to help relieve energy. So the stream is telling us something. It's telling us that that particular practice that we just did doesn't work, and it's 4 months later. So, then, fast forward to 2 years later, and you really can see this entire stream is downcut several feet, and the eroding banks upstream and downstream. Now, maybe if this was a flood management technique, like, well, we save flooding down here, and we're pretty happy this way, but our neighbor downstream is pissed because now all that stuff is down in his lawn. Now he's flooding. So we have to be very conscientious about how we approach stream management, because what we think is a good idea here ends up turning to become more problems downstream. So dredging. Dredging is another example where we do stream management techniques to help move waters through the area and help reduce flooding problems. So again, the dredging process is where we come in with a machine and scoop up and lower the channel bed elevation. So one tool that we have is what you see out in the lobby is a stream table. And I've been working with Professor Davis up at Cornell on using that stream tool to show different stream management techniques. The traditional use of the stream table is to show like where rivers would erode, and if you manipulate here in one place, it causes a reaction on the stream banks in the other place. But what we wanted to do is use this tool to show how different the efficacy of stream management techniques for flood inundation, which is a little difficult to show in the beginning because we weren't getting very deep water in the stream tables. So we had to manipulate the stream table to actually get water depth where we can have it spill over on a floodplain. So after some late nights in the wet lab up there at Cornell, and some really weird looks from people when they said, hey, do you want to go out for a beer? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to play in the sandbox at 10 o'clock at night. We finally came up with a solution of how to do this. Now, this is just a pilot project that we did, showing the efficacy of dredging. Now, there's many other different ways that we could use a stream table to show how different stream management techniques work. But this is the one that we came up with right away because we know that this is a conversation piece that comes up a lot, is dredging. So let's run the movie, and it's about a couple minutes in length. I'm not going to narrate as we go through, and there's also the text here. So now we have the town of Bedrock because our homes are made out of stone. And that's where Fred Flintstone and his family live, and that's where Bam Bam lives. And we have this stream that's been moved over to the valley wall, and now our farm fields have been replaced with houses with wooden sheds. And so now our stream is moving along here, nice and happy-like. And over time, though, since we have sediments moving through the system, we start to see accumulation along the riverbed. And our water now is starting to, we're starting to lose capacity to move water through the system, so we're starting to flood. So now our town of Bedrock is flooding. And you can see some of the debris moving through the system. And then it's coming in from upstream, and everyone's panicking because now we have a flooding problem running down the main street. So typically the response is a knee-jerk emotional reaction. We have to do something today, or this is what we have to do. And so that's when we get into our bulldozers and our excavators, and we start dredging out our stream. The hand of God has come, and now we're cleaning up all our town again and putting it all back together. This is a plan view of the same scenario as we run through here. So now what's happening is our stream, after we got our dredging, we alleviated our flood problem. But it's starting to fill back in again because we have a sediment supply upstream that starts to fill in and cause that channel bed that we lowered to raise again. So now we're back into a situation where we're going to start to see flooding again, and then we're going to have to go back in dredging. So this is based on observation. This is a stream table. This is an educational tool to kind of demonstrate this. But in real life, there are many examples out there where we have dredged, but dredging has to be repeated. And for communities who are strapped in cash, that's really tough to do because you may be able to sell some of that gravel, but the overall cost is going to be notable where we're going to have, it's not going to be a financially viable solution. So, and also from an ecological standpoint, it's devastating to the aquatics that live along the stream bed. You know, I've talked to a lot of fishermen here who say, like, I haven't seen the macroinvertebrates like they used to be. Well, you know, if we start manipulating the channel bottom and doing dredging and doing some other kind of these invasive activities, we're not giving those macroinvertebrates, which are sources of fish for food, a chance to really survive and thrive. So we have to be, you know, take this all into consideration when we start doing our local flood analysis of, like, what is financially viable for the town. And, you know, if we want to provide short-term flooding solutions, okay, but can the town afford multiple maintenance programs to keep this mitigation solution viable? Okay, so that would be, that's it for that movie clip there. So again, in summary, it provides temporary relief from flooding, but over the long term, assuming constant sediment supply, and that dredging efficacy starts to decrease. So then, again, moving that channel and straightening it. You know, that was a practice that's been around since the mid to late 1800s. Now, instead of a horse and you know, your 500 kids that you had, because that's how big your family was back then, we now have an excavator that's run by one of your kids, because that's all the kids we have these days. But we know that doesn't work. And so here's a classic example of, you see here, here's the floodplain on either side of the river, and the remnants of an earthen berm that basically bordered that entire river that was widened over. And this is a great photo because it shows that this is what rivers really want to do. They want us to make a sinuous path through it. So again, if we're going to go down this approach, this infrastructure is going to have to be maintained. It's going to have to be sometimes built higher, especially if we have sediments moving through the system, which raise the channel bed elevation. They're static solutions in a dynamic environment. So we need to make an informed approach. If this is something that we're going to do, we need to be smart about it and know what the long-term financial costs are. Because I don't like to design something that people are going to have to come back and maintain, because usually it doesn't end up being maintained, and that will lead to failure, which then looks bad on me, and I don't need that and more help to do that. And also, you know, it doesn't do anybody any good if it has to be continually maintained and operated. And so the other things that we started to learn more about is geomorphology, which again is the science between interaction between water and the surrounding land processes, the landforms. And this is a conceptual model that describes the relationship between sediments and between water. And what we've talked about is that if we start steepening the slope of our streams, we start improving the capacity of the water to move. So here on the scale of justice and stream morphology, on one side of the equation you have QS, which is sediment supply. On the other side, and then the other variable on this side of the scale is the size of sediment. So if we were to go in here and all of a sudden increase our sediment supply, so we denuded our landscape in the late 1800s, we had a lot more sediments running through here. Well, what that does is it drives the scale upwards. And so this side correspondingly goes down. Well, on this side of the scale we have water, and we have the discharge water, and we have slope. So if the sediment supply were to go up, and then a lot more sediments are being delivered to our channel, well, this, in order to compensate, needs to go back up to come back into equilibrium. In order to do that, our slope starts to flatten out. We start to get this aggradation, we get some more deposition in here. So our slope starts to compensate because it's now our streams are choked off with all of these sediments. Conversely, if we were to increase our slope, so we were to channelize our channel, take it from a nice sinuous pathway and straighten it, now our slope has gone up. So this side of the scale has gone up that way. Now, to compensate, to go back to equilibrium, the stream is going to go faster, it's going to move bigger sediments, and what's remaining is a much larger size sediment that's in its path. So it will compensate by going through there. So we understand these sediment and water dynamics now, where we didn't used to back in the early 1900s. The next thing that we have now going for us is modeling tools. And this is really kind of the heart of the local flood analysis. What we're trying to understand is, when it floods, how deep is the water and how fast is it moving? If I'm in the green, and in this area here, the deeper the water is, the bluer the color, the shallower the water, the greener the color. So if my house is in the green, I'm only going to get wet, from 0 to 1 feet. But if I'm over here in more of the blue, I'm getting sunk in 5 to 10 feet worth of water. Well, this is a good map to tell us where to maybe find some mitigation opportunities. This is called a depth grid. So when it floods, how deep is the water and where it is? Basically, it's taking the water surface elevation and subtracting out the underlying topography to give us the depth of water in different locations. So these kind of maps we can develop using hydraulic modeling, which is a software program that does our calculations for us, because to do something like this by hand, it would take a big team of hydraulic engineers to complete, and now we've eliminated all their jobs, and now it's down to like one person who can sit behind a computer to do that. So it's kind of self-defeating in a way, but we get a better result faster, and we can do different mitigation strategies and play around with it a lot better. So we look for opportunities to reduce flooding based on identifying some areas where we may have, we can block off water from certain areas than from others. Also getting back to that diagram of the sediment and water relationship, that scale that we just looked at, we also understand more about the relationship between streams and their floodplains. We're going away from the channelization approach and building in floodplains. This restoration project, if you were to go out to where you registered early this morning, there's an easel up there, and you can see a pre-condition photo where this entire bank was a huge mass failure, about 40 feet tall, forget the length, a couple hundred feet long, and continually providing, slumping into the river and sending all sorts of sediments downstream. Well, the solution was let's stabilize, let's remove a lot of that weight from the bank, build in some floodplain, and allow our stream to, when it floods, to flood in the floodplain, and that slows down the water, and that reduces the erosion from the bank. So we started to understand more about the relationship between floodplains and in-stream water dynamics. And then also another common technique is now, instead of just trying to keep the river in place by using large features that prevent the river from flooding out to its floodplain, we're building in-stream structures that will help guide sediments through the particular locations. So here in this figure here, this is what's called a cross vein. And so as the river water flows through here, this is the wet part of the season, but as the floodwaters come through here during a flood, the focal energy is still focused in the center of the stream. So that will help move the river more in a natural pathway, as opposed to just trying to armor it in place using berms on either side. Another way of helping move water in certain directions but still allow it to be sinuous is using flow deflection structures, such as groins or barbs. And in this case, this is an engineered log jam that was built to help guide the stream to be able to still build its sinuosity within the stream path, but to provide protection for a piece of infrastructure downstream. So we're taking what we've learned over the previous decades and taking it up a notch and saying, well, we can do all that. We can deflect the water away from critical infrastructure. We can encourage deposition where we want it to do it, but we also can do it in a way where we can benefit the aquatic habitat. So this is built on the South Fork of the Toutle River, which is on the north side of Mount St. Helens after it blew. Another good example of how we know what works and what doesn't work is that now we had this endless supply of sediment coming through here. So it's a constant supply of sediment, and trying to continue to dredge that out, not going to be cost effective. Trying to manipulate and channelize a channel by berming it up isn't going to be effective, because sediments will move through here and just fill it all up, and it'll spill out of its berms. So instead of doing that kind of approach, we're putting in flow deflection structures, these engineered log jams, that will help guide the river through certain areas. So what we do is if the river is flowing directly at that, that's a quasi-impermeable surface, and so it's going to want to naturally tend to go one way or the other. And if we have these built in a series, that then the water, when it hits this, it's going to want to go to this way because on this side we have more of these downstream. So now the water is trending to go that way. It's still allowed the sinuosity to develop, but it's also depositing sediments downstream of this to build in a floodplain. So now we're working with the river and understanding what its dynamics are without having to put hard and fast structures in there. The other thing that we talk about in these local flood analysis, which is it involves the engineering part about this, but also the social engineering about, is your floodplain development ordinances. How are you going to allow your communities to grow? Beforehand, in the 1900s, there really wasn't a lot of thought to where buildings were located and where they're being developed, and just went up wherever you could put them in here. But now we know that's not sustainable financially or from a flood mitigation standpoint, because the rivers are going to flood, and we need to give it floodplain to flood in. But if we have most of our city focused right on the edge of the building, right on the edge of the river, there's going to be some competition there about who's going to win, and water will always win. And so we have to be conscious about that. And so these floodplain development ordinances will help. Right now, the communities are starting to look at this and saying, well, let's do smart growth. Let's still be able to sustain our tax base and allow houses to be built, but not not put them in harm's way where they're actually exacerbating the flooding problem. So here again, this is a diagram of here we have our house situated outside of the active floodplain. So that's kind of the emphasis of these floodplain development ordinances is okay, we have to deal with the existing conditions, but what can we do to prevent future problems? And can we do it in a smart and informed way? So, for instance, now if we were to go without a floodplain development ordinance and just say, okay, everyone can build wherever they want to, now we have the part of the floodplain being built in with infrastructure and houses and industry. Well, that floodplain that was available to the river now is cut off, and so that river has to flood someplace else, which is going to start flooding into houses that normally weren't flooding. This is the condition that we're trying to prevent with floodplain development ordinances, because that's going to cost money to fix. It didn't cost money before. And so if we can develop our floodplains in a strategic way, we'll save money in the long run. So now, because the beauty of time travel is that not only can we go back in time, we also can go forward in time. And so we jump in our DeLorean one more time, and now we have Highway 28. We can hit 90 miles pretty easily, which I did yesterday. No, I didn't do that. I saw 9 state troopers in my drive down here the other day. I don't know if it's there's a quota or texting while driving or something, but I couldn't believe it. So be really careful if you're trying to jump into time on your way home today. So one last time we jump into the future, and what does this look like? So some of the trends is looking at what works and what doesn't work, and thinking ahead of what kind of technology and what kind of planning that we can do to really do informed flood management techniques in the future. Now, through our experience, we help communities develop floodplain development ordinances. A lot of times, either if the community doesn't even have one, they default to the state, which the state's ordinance is pretty loose. It really looks at parcels, projects on an individual basis. So, for instance, if you're in a FEMA delineated floodplain, there are 2 zones. There's a floodplain, which is the most extent that the water will go during a flood, during the 100-year flood, then also the floodway. And in the floodway, they say the state standard is that you can't have any rise within the floodway. So you can't build something within a floodway and have it cause a rise in the water surface elevation. In the floodplain, they say that you can't build something that results in a 1-foot increase of the 100-year water surface elevation at flood time. Well, that's pretty hard to do. You have to fill in a lot of floodplain to get a foot rise to do that. And it also only looks at one single project per time. Now, if I had 5 projects and each one of those raised the flood waters 0.8 feet, I meet the floodplain development ordinance by the state. But now I have 5 projects, so 0.8 times 5, okay, math again, 4 feet. But that's not covered under most communities' development ordinances. It's looking at cumulative effects of multiple developments. So, I can't be proved wrong because it's in the future, so I'm just going to throw out a bunch of stuff right now. So what I think is going to happen is that communities are going to look at floodplain development ordinance much of the way after zoning ordinances. They're thinking ahead of what they want their communities to look like, where they want their smart growth to happen, their commercial districts, their mixed-use districts, their single-family, multifamily areas. This is their projection of where they want their community to grow, that these floodplain development ordinances will be modeled after that, that based on what their floodplains want to look like in the future, they know what's an allowable increase in order to avoid worse future impacts from flooding. To avoid situations like this, that now that the house that wasn't flooded is now getting flooded because this was one of 4 or 5 projects that then all of a sudden raised the 100-year water surface elevation 4 feet. So now it's getting flooded. The next thing is drones. I'm jumping on this bandwagon because now with drones and with laser detection, we can really get really high-end topographic survey information. Where before it took a crew of 2, multiple days of going through and getting a survey done, you only could get maybe a 1-foot contour after several days. But with drones, they can carry laser equipment, LiDAR, which is I can't remember the acronym, but it's a light or laser detection device where the laser is shot from a plane that's flying a couple thousand feet above the floor, above the valley floor, and shooting lasers down, and those lasers bounce back up to a receiver, and they know the distance between the plane and between the topography below, and they can start generating topographic maps from that. Good resolution. Usually you can get about a 2-foot to a 1-foot contour map. Very pricey. You need a big area in order to make it cost effective. With drones, you could fly at lower elevations and spend less, and go slower throughout the channel area and cover a couple thousand feet of channel if you want to, and get really high resolution data. And optimally, what we'd like to see is if we can get contour maps down to the 3-inch interval, because once you start talking about gravel movements and cobble movements and sediments, which have been a problem in our watershed, if we can get the resolution down to the typical size of one of those stones, then we can really start to understand exactly what our streams look like. So they're using drone technology, and it's coming. Right now the FAA has a moratorium on using drones for commercial purposes, but I know of 5 exemptions they've already gone to surveying companies who want to use drones to do lower aerial topographic surveys, and I'm waiting to talk back to some of my colleagues from Delta, but I think they're going to lift that pretty soon for using commercial purposes for topography, because they usually are flying in low elevations outside of the airplane traffic and also in less sensitive areas. So it's moving that direction. The other part of the equation that I like to see more of that is starting to come out is sediment tracking. That's the other part of the equation of what size sediments move when. And so what I'd like to see is in the future is more technology where we can actually insert accelerometers and GPS tracking units into different size cobbles and gravels. So here it's used to be like you just paint numbers on it and hopefully you can find that rock downstream some point. But now if we could inject accelerometers and GPS tracking units into like 5,000 gravels and cobbles and then dump them upstream in the river, and we know the hydrology and the hydraulics moving through the river, we can really see how those sediments move through here, and that increases our understanding of critical shear stress that we talked about with our hands and everything, and we can really understand the model of behavior of sediments moving through the system. And then again, when the cyborgs make us their slaves, we have better computer processing speed. Right now, we have, the top of the line is available to a lot of the consultants in the industry is a two-dimensional model. Now, and the difference between one dimension is that you're just looking straight downstream, and the model calculates the water depth and the velocity moving by cross-section, cross-section, cross-section downstream. Well, that's great if I'm in a flume or in a really straight and narrow channel. But as we've seen, rivers turn. And when rivers turn, it's, the momentum of water is shifted towards the outside. Imagine if you're in a car and you're going in the straight and narrow on a racetrack. You can feel the compression against the back of the seat. That's the force, lateral force being applied in one direction as you're moving down the track. As soon as you go around that bend, you can start to see your coffee starting to turn and you're starting to turn in your passenger seat. Well, that's the momentum going in another direction, a two-dimensional direction. So now you're going laterally as well, as opposed to just longitudinally. So with two-dimensional computer processing, we can understand how water is shifting when it reaches the outside of those meander bends and starting to move towards the outside of the channel. And this gives us a better number for understanding the shear stress, understanding water depths and velocity, which help us be able to understand what in our designs, if we expect sediment deposition in this area, and how deep the water may be. So in the future, one of the things that slows us down is like if you have a long reach, at the computer processing time, it's a bear. It takes a while. I mean, you could you can spend days trying to model a particular area depending on how refined your mesh is. So typically a mesh, which is it's a programming term. It's basically what it sounds like. It's a mesh. It's a fishing net that's draped over your topography area. And the smaller the mesh, the more processing time that's needed. So usually you'll have, on really refined models, you'll have a mesh size about 5 by 5, or if it's in triangle, it's got about 5 to 7 square feet. But if you're trying to model gravels and cobbles that are moving, that's too coarse of a mesh. You need to shrink that up down to 3 inches size mesh. And that's going to just blow up any model that's out there. So with more processing speed and better computer processing, we can tighten up that mesh to a smaller area to actually understand what are the velocities happening at such a small scale. So then we know what the sediments are moving through the system. The other thing that really would change a lot of things is that these models, they assume one thing. They assume a static environment. They think that they don't have the process yet, most commercially available processes, to know that this bed, this topography underneath your channel isn't dynamically fluctuating during a flooding event. It's just assuming a static environment. But as you know, if you go out during the flood times in the Esopus or any other creek, you can hear stuff moving, right? That's pretty scary when you hear boulder balls moving down the stream. Well, that bed is moving. And so when it moves, you have different changes in your velocities and your shear stresses along the channel bed. That we just don't have that yet. But in 2035 or whatever it is, the same year the Yankees won the World Series again, we'll have this, this understanding of better processing speed through there. So at the end of the day, like these local flood analysis that we're trying to do in these communities, they will take all of this historical context of how we got to where we are today based on our land use and their relationship with the in-stream and the floodplains, and come up with a way that we can survive and have resiliency in our communities based on that historical context and what we want to be in the future. So it's my opinion that we can do that we have opportunities to look for areas where we can mitigate flooding, whether on a large scale or a micro scale, and still have our areas to grow and to recreate. And this right here is that building that we saw in one of the original slides that was under about 6 feet of water. It It was the Fresh Market and the CVS right there. And so I think in the future we can get to that location where we can still have a thriving community, good tax base, and really smart growth, but still be able to live within our river basins. So with that, I'd like to thank you for my presentation today. And flooding doesn't end at a dead end at your municipal boundary. It keeps going on downstream, and that goes for the neighbor upstream. So we have to work together in terms of coming up with more of a reach-wide, holistic solution for it all.
Great job. I sort of sitting here thinking that I've been talking about this issue for the last 2 decades, and people like you now have taken up the burden and doing a wonderful job about it. One of the things that we didn't consider 20 years ago when Rajan was coming up here and trying to convince people this was a good idea is superstorms. We didn't have these weather events that were in our mind when we were designing systems, and now the 100-year floodplain is the 5-year floodplain. And I'm wondering how this modeling can accept these unusual events.
So what goes into our hydraulic models are 2 things. The geometric information, the topography that goes into what our floodplain and what our in-stream looks like. And the other end that goes in is the hydrology. And so the hydrology is what captures the amount of water that's coming into our area of interest. And that is determined by a series of calculations and analysis of either one, known USGS stream gauges, where we can actually go to that stream gauge and tie into a historic record and understand with that, that historic record, we can do projections of what the large storms are going to be. The second way to understand the hydrology is to use in areas, so such as the southern tier of the Catskills, all the known USGS gauges in those areas, and be able to extrapolate from that data set into what we know now. Now, you brought up a very good question, that these superstorms that come in, they're infrequent, and they are very large in terms of the amount of water that comes through. What we use now in a lot of our processing of the USGS stream gauges is an equation, statistical analysis called the log Pearson approach. FEMA calls it the Schedule 17B. And it's a statistical analysis of historical records data. And what it does is it starts to identify, it basically puts your annual peak flows into bins. And then from those analysis of the bins, it projects out what are the outlying storms that are going to be there. Now that was an approach that was developed back in the 60s and 70s, when we didn't have that much stream data to begin this analysis. So now, my understanding is that there are a couple academics and FEMA are working together to revamp that log Pearson analysis, to start really looking at the bigger things, the bigger data sets, and these really outlier storms that normally would be excluded from the statistical analysis because they were such outliers, but to incorporate them back into the statistical analysis as true data, which would help influence the results of what we project out for the 5, 10, 100-year flow. So from that calculation from the hydrology, I think that is what's changing. The other important part is not just these superstorms, but the frequency, the increase in frequency of our more minor flooding events. So Cornell, the Climate Center at Cornell has some projections out that the number of 2-inch rain events over the next 30 years is supposed to increase by 20%. So those frequent flooding events are your big drivers in these communities, because those are the ones that are going to start to flood your culverts, whether they're driveway culverts, whether you're road culverts. Those are the nuisance floodings. Now, they don't make the federal declaration disasters or anything like that, but over a cumulative effect, they can have pretty notable economic impacts. We'll do a question here. Okay.
I live in Lower East Sopus, and we've seen a lot of erosion with the people that are living in East Sopus, Lower East Sopus, and everything that you mentioned has happened in the Lower East Sopus. So,
good, that's great.
It's, the river has changed, the erosion has been terrible, people's houses have been affected. As communities, like, what can we do to, outreach, educate people, get the farmers involved, and really get the communities together to help to mitigate this, because a river knows no, states and local communities. It just keeps going. Right. So we need towns all along these estuaries and rivers to come together and figure out what to do, because like you said, downstream people are affected with upstream type of situations. Thank you.
The answer to your question starts here. It's about the people at this conference going back into their own communities and talking to their neighbors who weren't here today, to talk to them about that flooding doesn't begin and end at a political boundary, that we all as a community can actually work together to improve it. So community cohesion is really a main driver for a successful flood mitigation event. Because one thing that we have seen is that if there's one neighbor who feels either excluded or not informed or educated about a certain flooding, reason of flooding, and they don't want to participate in a flood mitigation strategy, that could really limit the amount of, and constrain the amount of tools that we have on the table to solve flooding problems. So the community cohesion aspect is really important for flood mitigation because it's not site specific, it's reach specific. So the more people who are involved in the process, which we're trying to do in the town of Olive, you'll end up with a better solution. So that's the first step. The next step is looking not just as what you said, like from a community standpoint, from just everyone working on their own LFA, but perhaps looking at other reach-wide solutions. So maybe some LFAs working together upstream with downstream LFAs, if there's ways that we can help mitigate from the upstream and help the downstream neighbor at the same time. To me, that is a logical next step. We're doing work within Broome County. We were tasked with doing a flood mitigation analysis for the entire county, which had its own unique challenges because of the lack of data and the amount of municipalities that we're dealing with. But how we prioritize sites, besides their benefit cost, was how many adjoining municipalities could actually benefit. And one thing that we've found is that the more benefits that we can get from one site, the better. Because then it makes it more easier to get funding from a grant. And so what usually the existing constraints are is that a municipality with flooding problems, it's very hard for them to spend money in a different municipality to solve their problems. Politically, it doesn't make it's a hard sell. The county planning department, which sponsored this study, transcends those political boundaries. So that's one way to approach it, is having, from a county perspective, approaching municipal benefit solutions, maybe joining up LFAs together.